They told me it was a research station, but I quickly learned that there are rules here, unspoken ones, that you can't break. And if you do, the consequences are far more severe than you can fathom. The helicopter's rotors cut through the Arctic air like metallic screams as we descended towards Station Echo 7. Below us stretched an endless expanse of white, broken only by jagged ice formations that looked like the fossilized remains of some ancient civilization. The research station appeared as a cluster of dark rectangles against the pristine snow, connected by covered walkways that reminded me of blood vessels spreading across pale skin. My breath fogged the helicopter's window as I pressed my face against the glass, mesmerized by the alien landscape. This was my first assignment to such a remote location, and the isolation both thrilled and terrified me. As a climatologist specializing in permafrost dynamics, I had dreamed of working in the Arctic for years. The opportunity to study the effects of climate change on the most pristine ecosystem on Earth felt like the pinnacle of my career. The pilot, a weathered man named Hansen who looked like he'd been carved from the same ice as the landscape, glanced back at me with pale blue eyes. "First time up here?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. I nodded, unable to hide my excitement despite the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. "Piece of advice," Hansen said, his expression serious. "Follow the rules at Echo 7. All of them, even the ones that don't make sense." He paused, studying my face. "Especially those ones." Before I could ask what he meant, the helicopter touched down with a jarring thud. The rotors began to slow, and through the dying mechanical whine, I heard something else, a sound like distant howling that seemed to come from the ice itself. The station's entrance door opened, and 3 figures emerged, bundled in heavy parkas that obscured their faces. They moved with purpose across the snow, their boots crunching rhythmically. As they approached, I noticed something odd about their formation. They walked in a perfect triangle, maintaining exact distances from each other, as if following some invisible choreography. The lead figure reached the helicopter first and pulled back his hood, revealing a man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and intense dark eyes. His skin had the leathery quality of someone who had spent too much time in harsh conditions. But there was something else in his expression, a wariness that seemed to go beyond mere caution about the environment. "Dr. Sarachun," he asked, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Dr. Marcus Reeves, Station Commander. Welcome to Echo 7. I shook his hand, noticing how his grip lingered a moment too long, as if he were assessing something about me through that contact. "Thank you, Dr. Reeves. I'm excited to begin work on the permafrost samples." "Of course you are," he said, but there was something in his tone that made the enthusiasm sound almost dangerous. "We'll get you settled and oriented. There are protocols here that might seem unusual to someone from the outside world." The other 2 figures flanked me as we walked toward the station. They introduced themselves as Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist, and Dr. James Morton, a geologist. Both were polite but distant, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if watching for something. I noticed that they, too, maintained that strange triangular formation as we walked. The station's interior was a maze of narrow corridors painted in institutional white, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. The air smelled of recycled oxygen, industrial disinfectant, and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't identify. Every surface was meticulously clean, almost sterile, yet I had the unsettling feeling that the cleanliness was hiding something rather than revealing it. Dr. Reeves led me through the main corridor, pointing out various facilities, the laboratory spaces, the communication center, the dining hall. But I noticed that certain doors remained conspicuously unmarked, and when I asked about them, his answers were vague and evasive. "Storage mostly," he would say, "or mechanical systems. Nothing that concerns your research." We passed a bulletin board covered with what looked like a normal collection of duty rosters, safety notices, and general announcements. But among them was a list titled Station Protocols that made my stomach tighten as I read. 1. All personnel must maintain visual contact with at least one other person during daylight hours. 2. The communication array is to be checked every 4 hours, regardless of weather conditions. 3. No one goes outside alone after sunset. No exceptions. 4. Report any unusual sounds from the ice immediately to station command. 5. Do not attempt to investigate the source of sounds originating from below ground level. 6. All research samples must be logged and secured before 1800 hours daily. 7. Personal quarters must be sealed and locked between 2200 and 0600 hours. 8. Do not respond to voices calling your name if you cannot see the speaker. The list continued, but Dr. Reeves had moved on, and I had to hurry to catch up. When I asked about the protocols, he gave me a tight smile. Safety measures, he said. The Arctic can play tricks on your mind. Isolation, extreme cold, endless darkness during winter. It affects people in ways you might not expect. These rules help keep everyone healthy and productive. My assigned quarters were sparse, but functional. A bed, a small desk, a tiny bathroom, and a single window that looked out onto the vast white expanse. As I unpacked my belongings, I noticed that my window had no ordinary latch. Instead, it was secured by what looked like a military-grade locking mechanism, as if it were designed to keep something out rather than simply to seal against the cold. Dinner was served in the communal dining hall, a room that felt too large for the 8 people stationed at Echo 7. The conversation was polite but stilted, filled with the kind of careful neutral topics that people use when they're avoiding something important. I tried to learn more about my colleagues' research, but their responses were vague and often contradictory. Dr. Vasquez mentioned studying marine microbiology in extreme environments, but when I asked about her sample collection methods, she changed the subject. Dr. Morton claimed to be researching geological stability, yet I had seen no core drilling equipment during my tour of the facilities. As the evening wore on, I noticed other peculiarities. The staff members frequently glanced at their watches, and at exactly 2,200 hours, they all stood up simultaneously, as if responding to some signal I couldn't hear. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat. "Time for evening protocols," he announced. "Dr. Chun, someone will brief you on the night shift procedures tomorrow. For tonight, I recommend to get some rest. And remember, keep your door locked." I watched as they filed out in their strange, triangular formations, leaving me alone in the dining hall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear that same howling sound I had noticed when the helicopter landed. But now it seemed closer, more insistent. Walking back to my quarters, I passed one of the unmarked doors I had noticed earlier. It was slightly ajar, and, through the gap, I glimpsed what looked like banks of computer monitors displaying scrolling data. But what caught my attention was the sound coming from behind the door, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost organic, like a massive heartbeat. I paused, fighting the urge to investigate. The 8th protocol echoed in my mind. Do not respond to voices calling your name if you cannot see the speaker. What kind of research station needed a rule like that? As I reached my room, I found a manila envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with additional protocols, written in a different handwriting. Personal advisory for Dr. Chun. Trust no one completely, but never let them know you don't trust them. The ice beneath the station is not stable. Do not investigate vibrations or sound from below. If you hear knocking on your door after midnight, do not answer, regardless of who claims to be outside. Document everything, but keep your real observations hidden. The research here is not what they told you it was. If you need help, leave a red mark on your doorframe. Someone will find you. The note wasn't signed, but the paper felt urgent in my hands, as if whoever wrote it had been desperate to warn me. I read it 3 times before hiding it in my personal notebook. As I prepared for bed, I checked and double-checked the military-grade lock on my window. Outside, the Arctic wind held across the ice, but underneath that natural sound, I swore I could hear something else. Something that sounded almost like voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. I had come to Echo 7 expecting to study climate change and permafrost dynamics. Instead, I found myself wondering what kind of research really took place in this isolated outpost, and why a simple weather monitoring station needed protocols that read like survival instructions for a horror movie. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of endless white corridors and the persistent feeling that I was being watched. In my dreams, the ice beneath the station pulsed like a living thing, and the howling wind carried words I almost understood but desperately didn't want to comprehend. When I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my room, I remembered Hansen's warning and Dr. Reeves' strange smile. I lay perfectly still, listening to the footsteps pause outside my door, and realized that my real education at Station Echo 7 was just beginning. My first official day at Echo 7 began before dawn, which in the Arctic meant it began in the same endless darkness that had swallowed the previous evening. I was awakened not by an alarm clock, but by a gentle knock on my door, exactly 3 taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. When I opened it, I found Dr. Elena Vasquez standing in the hallway, already dressed in her work clothes. "Morning briefing in 10 minutes," she said, her voice professionally neutral. But her eyes darted nervously down the corridor before meeting mine again. "Bring your notebook. And Dr. Chun, don't mention anything about last night to the others." Before I could ask what she meant, she had already moved on to the next door, delivering the same 3-tap sequence. I dressed quickly, my mind racing. What about last night was I supposed to keep secret? The strange footsteps? The anonymous note? The pulsing sound from behind the unmarked door? The briefing room was small and windowless, lit by the same harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to illuminate every corner of the station. Dr. Reeves stood at the front beside a whiteboard covered in what looked like weather data, but the numbers didn't match any meteorological patterns I recognized. The other staff members sat in their usual triangular formation, notebooks open, pens poised. "Dr. Chun," Dr. Reeves began without preamble, "today you'll begin your orientation to our data collection procedures. Dr. Morton will show you the sample storage facility, and Dr. Vasquez will explain our documentation protocols." He paused, studying my face. "I trust you slept well." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry. "Yes, thank you," I replied carefully. "Good. Sleep is important here. Disrupted sleep patterns can lead to complications." He turned to the whiteboard and pointed to a series of numbers. "These are yesterday's readings from our monitoring stations. As you can see, we're tracking several unusual phenomena." I studied the data, my confusion growing. The numbers were labeled as temperature readings, but they showed variations that were meteorologically impossible. Fluctuations of 40 degrees within minutes, patterns that seemed to repeat in perfect cycles. "These readings," I said hesitantly, "they don't seem consistent with normal weather patterns." The room fell silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but when I looked around, they were all staring at their notebooks rather than at me. "The Arctic is an unusual environment," Dr. Reeves said finally. "Traditional models don't always apply. You'll understand better once you've been here longer." Dr. Morton cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should show Dr. Chin the sample collection area first. Get her familiar with our procedures." The sample storage facility was located in the station's lower level, accessed by a narrow staircase that seemed to descend deeper into the ice than should have been structurally possible. The walls here were different, not the painted metal of the upper levels, but what looked like natural ice that had been somehow fused with steel reinforcements. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, and I could hear that rhythmic pulsing sound more clearly. Permafrost samples are stored in specialized containers, Dr. Morton explained, leading me through a maze of storage units. Each unit was labeled with coordinates and dates, but I noticed that many of the dates went back decades, far longer than Echo 7 had supposedly been operational. How long has the station been active? I asked. Dr. Morton hesitated. The current iteration has been running for about 5 years, but there have been previous research efforts in this location. We stopped in front of a storage unit that looked different from the others. Instead of the standard metal containers, this one held what appeared to be organic specimens suspended in a clear fluid. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, part mineral, part organic, with structures that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. What are these? I asked, leaning closer to examine the samples. Deep core specimens, Dr. Morton said quickly, but his voice was tight with what sounded like fear. Very old permafrost, probably prehistoric organic matter. But as I watched, one of the specimens pulsed with the same rhythm I had been hearing throughout the station. The fluid around it swirled slightly, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw what looked like an eye opening within the organic mass. I stepped back, my heart racing. These samples are active. Preserved organic matter can sometimes exhibit pseudobiological responses to temperature changes, Dr. Morton said, but he was already guiding me away from the storage unit. Nothing to be concerned about, just standard preservation artifacts. As we climbed back toward the upper levels, I couldn't shake the image of that eye-like structure. The specimens hadn't looked like preserved organic matter. They had looked alive, aware, and somehow patient, as if they were waiting for something. The rest of the morning was spent learning the station's documentation protocols from Dr. Vasquez. Every piece of data collected had to be recorded in triplicate. One copy for the official logs, one for station records, and one for what she called personal verification. Why 3 copies? I asked. Dr. Vasquez glanced around the laboratory before answering. Sometimes official records change. It's important to have backup documentation. She lowered her voice. Things here aren't always what they seem, Dr. Chun. The ice preserves many things. Some of them should stay preserved. Before I could ask what she meant, Dr. Reeves appeared in the laboratory doorway. Dr. Chun, I'd like you to review the communication protocols. We maintain regular contact with our oversight committee. The communication center was located on the station's upper level, a room filled with sophisticated radio equipment and satellite communication arrays. But what struck me immediately was the security setup. Multiple locks, reinforced walls, and what looked like a panic button mounted near the main console. We maintain contact with our funding agency twice daily, Dr. Reeves explained, showing me the communication schedule. Morning reports at 0800 and evening summaries at 2000. All communications are logged and recorded. I examined the communication logs, noting that the conversation seemed unusually scripted and repetitive. Each entry followed the same format: weather conditions, staff status, research progress. But there were no specifics about the research itself, no scientific data being transmitted, no request for additional supplies or personnel rotations. What about emergency communications? I asked. If someone needed immediate medical attention or evacuation. Dr. Reeves' expression darkened slightly. Emergency protocols are handled differently. But Dr. Chun, I want to be very clear about something. Unauthorized communications are strictly prohibited. All contact with the outside world must go through official channels. As if to emphasize his point, he showed me a locked cabinet containing what appear to be personal communication devices: cell phones, satellite phones, portable radios. Personal devices are stored here for the duration of each assignment, for security reasons. That evening, I found myself alone in the dining hall after the others had performed their mysterious 2,200 hours ritual. I used the opportunity to explore the station more thoroughly, moving quietly through the corridors and paying close attention to the sounds and layout. The unmarked doors I had noticed on my first day were all sealed with electronic locks that required key cards I didn't have. But one door, near the end of a lesser-used corridor, had been left slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see a room filled with monitors displaying what looked like seismic data, but the patterns were unlike any earthquake readings I had ever seen. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the specimens in the storage facility. As I watched the monitors, I began to understand that the research at Echo 7 wasn't about climate change or permafrost dynamics. The station was monitoring something beneath the ice, something that was very much alive and apparently growing stronger. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly retreated to my quarters. As I locked my door and prepared for bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my door frame, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, someone had left a small red mark, exactly like the signal mentioned in the anonymous note I had received. Someone else at Echo 7 knew the truth about what was happening here, and they were trying to help me. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from deep within the ice itself, I began to understand why the station protocols existed. They weren't guidelines for conducting research in a harsh environment. They were survival instructions for living on top of something ancient and malevolent that was slowly awakening. The question wasn't what we were studying at Echo 7. The question was what was studying us. The third day brought my first real glimpse of what Echo 7 was truly built to contain. I woke to find another note slipped under my door, this one written in the same desperate handwriting as the first. Meet me in Lab 3 during the evening protocol gathering. Come alone. Bring your notebook and wear your warmest clothes. It's time you saw what's really happening here. Elena. Dr. Vasquez had left the red mark on my door. Throughout the morning briefing and my assigned duties, I watched her carefully, looking for any sign of acknowledgement. She gave none, maintaining the same professional distance she had shown since my arrival. But during lunch, when she passed behind my chair, she whispered a single word: tonight. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to focus on the busy work Dr. Reeves had assigned me, cataloging surface temperature readings that I now knew were fabricated. But my mind kept returning to the specimens in the storage facility and the seismic monitors I had glimpsed the night before. At 1800 hours, I noticed increased activity around the station. Staff members moved with more urgency than usual, checking and rechecking equipment, securing loose items, and performing what looked like pre-storm preparations. But when I checked the weather forecast, it showed clear conditions for the next several days. Storm protocols, Dr. Morton explained when I asked about the activity. We get sudden weather changes up here. Better to be prepared. But I had seen real storm preparations before, and this wasn't one. The staff were securing the station as if they expected something to come from below, not above. At 2,200 hours, I watched the others file out of the dining hall in their triangular formations, then waited 10 minutes before making my way to Lab 3. The corridor was dark except for the emergency lighting, and the familiar pulsing sound seemed louder in the quiet station. Elena was waiting for me, wearing a heavy parka and carrying a similar one for me. Her face was pale but determined. "Put this on," she said without preamble. "And whatever you see tonight, don't speak unless I tell you it's safe. Sound carries in ways you wouldn't expect down here." She led me to a maintenance access I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a false panel in the laboratory wall. Beyond it lay a narrow tunnel that sloped steeply downward, following what appeared to be a natural fissure in the ice. The walls were lined with heating elements and reinforced with metal supports, but I could see that the tunnel extended much deeper than any normal research facility would require. "How far down does this go?" I whispered. "About 300 meters, Elena replied, her voice barely audible. "To the real laboratory." the one they don't mention in the orientation briefings. As we descended, the temperature dropped noticeably despite the heating elements. The pulsing sound grew stronger, and I began to notice other sounds as well. A low humming that seemed to come from the ice itself, and occasionally, something that sounded almost like voices speaking in harmonious whispers. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took my breath away. The space was enormous, carved out of solid ice and rock, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above us. But what dominated the chamber was the structure at its center, a massive crystalline formation that pulsed with its own inner light. The crystal was unlike anything in geological literature. It stood nearly 30 meters tall, its faceted surface reflecting and refracting light in impossible ways. Veins of what looked like organic material ran through its structure, pulsing with the same rhythm I had been hearing since my arrival. And around its base, a network of cables and monitoring equipment connected it to banks of computers and analysis stations. My God, I breathed. What is it? We don't know exactly, Elena said, leading me closer to the monitoring stations. It was discovered during the initial excavation for Echo 7's foundation, about 8 years ago. The official station was built as a cover operation to study it. The monitoring equipment showed readings that defied explanation. Energy output fluctuated in complex patterns. Temperature readings showed impossible variations, and electromagnetic signatures indicated something far more active than any mineral formation should be. The original research team thought it was some kind of unusual crystal formation, Elena continued, pulling up data files on one of the computers. But as they studied it, they realized it was responding to their presence, not just physically, but intelligently. I stared at the data, my scientific training warring with the evidence before my eyes. That's impossible. Crystal formations can't exhibit intelligent behavior. Look at this, Elena said, showing me a graph of energy output over time. These spikes correspond exactly to human activity in the chamber. When researchers are present, it becomes more active. When they leave, it goes dormant. But look at this pattern from last week. The graph showed a dramatic increase in activity that had been building steadily, regardless of human presence. The crystal was becoming more active on its own, as if it were awakening. There's more, Elena said grimly. She led me to another monitoring station, this one displaying what looked like acoustic analysis. It's been producing sounds in the subsonic range. At first, we thought it was just geological stress, but when we analyzed the patterns, she played an audio file through headphones, and I heard something that made my skin crawl. The sounds weren't random. They had structure, rhythm, almost like language. And underneath the alien tones, I could swear I heard something familiar. Human voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, but with emotions I understood perfectly. Fear, pain, desperation. The voices, I said, pulling off the headphones. Are those previous research teams? Elena confirmed. Dr. Chun, this thing doesn't just respond to human presence. It absorbs it. The original team, the people who discovered it, they're still here in some form. Part of it now. I felt sick. How many people know about this? At the surface level, just the current team. But we're not the decision makers. There are others, people who fund this operation, who see the crystal as an opportunity rather than a threat. Elena's expression hardened. They think they can control it, study it, maybe even weaponize it. They don't understand that it's been studying us right back. As if responding to our conversation, the crystal pulsed brighter, and the acoustic sensors registered a surge of activity. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. It knows we're here, I said. It knows everything that happens in the station above, Elena replied. Every conversation, every movement, every thought we have while we're in its influence. The protocols aren't just safety measures. They're attempt to limit its ability to learn about us, to keep it from fully understanding human behavior. She pulled up another file, this one showing the station's layout overlaid with some kind of energy mapping. The influence extends upward through the ice. The entire station is within its range. That's why the rules exist. Why we can't be alone, why we have to maintain contact schedules, why certain areas are off limits. They're trying to create patterns it can't predict or exploit. But it's not working, I said, studying the energy readings. It's getting stronger. Elena nodded grimly. The last research update I saw suggested it's reached some kind of critical mass. The people who run this operation think they can harvest its energy, use it as a power source. They don't realize that it's not just a crystal. It's a communication device, maybe even a transportation system. And whatever it's communicating with is starting to respond. She showed me satellite imagery of the surrounding area, marked with energy readings taken over the past several months. The crystal's influence wasn't just growing stronger. It was spreading outward, creating a network of connected energy signatures across the Arctic ice. There are others, I realized. More crystals, more stations like this one. 12 that we know of, scattered across the Arctic and Antarctic, all showing the same patterns of increasing activity, all supposedly being studied by different research teams who don't know about each other. Elena's voice was tight with fear. But they're connected, Dr. Chun. They're part of something much larger than any of us realized. As we prepared to leave the chamber, I took one last look at the crystal. Its pulsing seemed almost eager now, as if our visit had energized it somehow. And in its faceted surface, I could swear I saw faces, human faces, pressing against the crystal from within, their mouths open in silent screams. The climb back to the surface felt like an eternity. Every step took us further from the truth and closer to the charade we had to maintain. As we reached the laboratory level, Elena grabbed my arm. Dr. Chun, whatever you decide to do with this information, be careful. The people who run Echo 7 have invested too much to let anyone threaten their project. And the crystal, it's been influencing people longer than we realized. Some of the staff, the ones who've been here longest, they're not entirely themselves anymore. As I returned to my quarters, I noticed Dr. Reeves standing at the end of the corridor, watching me with those intense dark eyes. He didn't speak, but his expression made it clear that he knew exactly where I had been and what I had seen. The crystal beneath Echo 7 wasn't just a subject of scientific study. It was an active participant in its own investigation, learning about humanity with every passing day. And tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to continue the pretense of normal research or find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. As I lay in bed, feeling the rhythmic pulsing through the floor beneath me, I realized that the crystal had been studying me too. And whatever conclusions it was drawing about human nature were about to be put to a test that could determine the fate of far more than just a remote Arctic research station. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing what lay beneath my feet, pulsing with alien intelligence and growing stronger by the hour? Instead, I sat at my small desk, documenting everything Elena had shown me, creating the kind of detailed record that might someday serve as evidence, if anyone survived to present it. At 0400 hours, my writing was interrupted by a sound I had never heard before in the station. It started as a low harmonic vibration, barely perceptible, but it quickly built into something that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The fluorescent light in my room flickered in rhythm with the sound, and I felt the floor trembling beneath my feet. Within minutes, I heard doors opening throughout the station and the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridors. I cracked open my door and saw the other researchers moving with urgent purpose, no longer maintaining their careful triangular formations. Dr. Reeves was at the center of the activity, issuing quiet but rapid orders. All monitoring stations active, he said as I stepped into the corridor. Full data collection protocols. This is what we've been waiting for. Elena appeared beside me, fully dressed despite the early hour. Her face was pale but determined. "It's happening," she whispered. "The network is activating." The entire staff converged on the communication center, which had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military command post. Banks of monitors showed data streams from locations I didn't recognize, other research stations, other crystals, other teams of scientists who thought they were conducting legitimate research. Dr. Reeves stood before the largest monitor, which displayed a map of the Arctic with pulsing dots scattered across its surface. As I watched, the dots began to pulse in synchronization, creating a pattern that seemed to ripple across the entire polar region. 12 stations, all showing coordinated activity. Dr. Morton reported, his voice tight with excitement and fear. Energy output has increased by 400% in the last hour, and the seismic readings. Dr. Reeves asked, "Massive, but not geological. The patterns are too regular, too purposeful. It's like they're communicating." I stared at the synchronized pulsing on a map, understanding dawning like ice water in my veins. The crystals weren't just connected. They were parts of a single entity, distributed across the polar regions like neurons in a vast brain. And that brain was finally fully awakening. "Dr. Chun," Dr. Reeves said, turning toward me with those intense dark eyes, "your timing couldn't be better. As a climatologist, your expertise will be invaluable in documenting what happens next." "What exactly is going to happen next?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Instead of responding, Dr. Reeves gestured toward another monitor, this one showing a live feed from the crystal chamber below. The massive crystalline structure was glowing brighter than I had ever seen it, its inner light pulsing so rapidly it was almost strobing. But what made my breath catch was the activity around its base. The organic veins running through the crystal had expanded, growing outward from the main structure like roots or blood vessels. They were spreading across the chamber floor, reaching toward the walls, and where they touched the ice itself began to change, becoming more translucent, taking on the same inner glow as the crystal. "It's growing," I said. "Expanding might be a better term," Dr. Reeves replied. "The crystalline network is establishing direct physical connections between the stations. Our models suggest the process will be complete within 48 hours. "Models?" I asked. "How long have you known this would happen?" Dr. Reeves smiled, and for the first time since my arrival, the expression seemed genuine rather than calculated. "Dr. Chun, we haven't been studying these formations. We've been nurturing them. The research stations, the carefully controlled environments, the human presence. It's all been designed to encourage this development." The truth hit me like a physical blow. You've been feeding them. Us. You've been feeding human consciousness to these things. The term feeding implies parasitism, Dr. Reeves said calmly. This is more of a symbiotic relationship. The network gains access to human intelligence and creativity, and in return, humanity gains access to technologies and capabilities beyond our current understanding. Elena stepped forward, her voice shaking with rage. "That's not what's happening, and you know it. Show her the Moscow station footage." Dr. Reeves' expression hardened, but Dr. Morton was already pulling up another video feed. This one showed what had once been a research station similar to Echo 7. But now the entire structure was covered in the same organic crystalline growth I had seen in the chamber below. The buildings were still recognizable, but they had been transformed into something that looked more grown than built. "Moscow Station stopped responding to communications 3 days ago," Elena said quietly. "But the energy readings suggest the crystal there has achieved full integration with the facility." "And the personnel?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Still there," Dr. Reeves said. "Still conducting research. Just enhanced." The video feed showed figures moving through the transformed station. They looked human at first glance, but something was wrong with their movements. Too coordinated, too purposeful, as if they were being directed by a single intelligence rather than acting as individuals. "This is what you're planning for all the stations?" I asked. "Turn us all into puppets for this network." "I prefer to think of it as evolution," Dr. Reeves replied. "Humanity has reached the limits of what we can achieve alone. The network offers us the chance to become part of something greater, to transcend the biological and intellectual constraints that have held our species back." I looked around the room at the other researchers, trying to gauge their reactions. Dr. Morton seemed genuinely excited by the prospect, his eyes bright with scientific fervor. Dr. Vasquez looked conflicted, glancing between the monitors and Elena with obvious uncertainty. The others, researchers I had barely spoken to since my arrival, watched the displays with expressions that seemed somehow vacant, as if they were already partially under the network's influence. "How long?" I asked. "How long before Echo 7 looks like Moscow Station?" "Based on the current rate of expansion, approximately 36 hours, Dr. Reeves said with a casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "The integration process is accelerating as more stations come online." Elena grabbed my arm. "Dr. Chun, we need to talk. Privately." But as we turned to leave, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red warning lights flashed in the corridors, and the monitors in the communication center erupted with urgent data streams. "What's happening?" I shouted over the noise. Dr. Morton was frantically working at his console, his face pale with shock. "The Greenland stations, both of them, just went dark. Complete communication blackout. Show me the satellite feeds," Dr. Reeves ordered. The main monitor switched to a high-resolution satellite view of the Greenland ice sheet, where 2 research stations had stood just hours before. There were now massive crystalline structures erupting from the ice like alien cathedrals. The formations were easily 10 times larger than the original stations, their surfaces pulsing with the same rhythmic light we had seen in our own chamber. "My God," someone whispered. "They're not just integrating the stations. They're transforming the entire landscape." As we watched, cracks appeared in the ice around the crystalline structures, spreading outward in perfect geometric patterns. The cracks glowed with the same inner light, creating a web of luminous lines across the frozen surface. "The permafrost," I said, understanding flooding through me. "They're not just growing through the research stations. They're using the permafrost itself as a growth medium, spreading through the ice layers." Dr. Reeves nodded grimly. "The network is more ambitious than we initially calculated. It's not just connecting the research stations. It's preparing to transform the entire polar ice system into a single, massive organism." The implications were staggering. The polar ice caps contained countless tons of frozen organic matter, ancient bacteria, and plant life preserved for millennia. If the network could access and integrate that biological material, it would have the resources to reshape not just the Arctic, but potentially the entire planet's ecosystem. "We have to get out of here," Elena said urgently. "Now, before the integration reaches our station." But Dr. Reeves shook his head. "I'm afraid that's no longer an option. Look at the external feeds." The monitors showing the area around Echo 7 revealed that the crystalline growth had already begun extending upward through the ice beneath our station. Glowing veins were visible through the transparent ice, spreading outward in all directions like the roots of some impossible tree. "The helicopter landing pad is already compromised," Dr. Reeves continued. "And even if we could somehow reach it, our pilots received orders not to approach any of the research stations until the integration process is complete." "Orders from whom?" I demanded. "From the people who fund this project, Dr. Chun. The ones who have been planning this transformation for decades." The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't a rogue scientific experiment that had gone wrong. It was a deliberate plan to use the Arctic Research Network as a vector for planetary transformation. The research stations have been built specifically to nurture and direct the crystal network's growth, and the scientists assigned to them were intended to be the first wave of human integration. How long have you known? I asked Elena. How long have you known what this really was? I figured it out about 6 months ago, she admitted. The official research data never matched what I was seeing in the field. When I started digging deeper, I found references to similar projects going back to the 1950s. This network, it's not naturally occurring. It was planted here, cultivated by human agencies for purposes we're only beginning to understand. Dr. Morton looked up from his console, his face ashen. The Antarctic stations are responding. All 7 of them just came online simultaneously. Energy output is off the charts. The map display now showed pulsing dots across both polar regions, their rhythmic flashing creating patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. As I watched, I realized the patterns weren't random. They were forming complex geometric shapes, mandalas of light that spoke to some deep, primitive part of my brain. "It's beautiful," Dr. Vasquez said softly, and I noticed that her voice had taken on a dreamy, distant quality, like a symphony made of light. Several of the other researchers were nodding in agreement, their eyes fixed on the pulsing displays with expressions of rapture. The network wasn't just expanding physically. It was already beginning to influence the minds of everyone in the station. "Don't look at the patterns directly," Elena warned, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from monitors. "It's using visual rhythm to synchronize brainwave patterns. The longer you watch, the more susceptible you become to integration." But it was already too late for some of the staff. Dr. Morton had stopped working at his console and was standing motionless, his eyes reflecting the pulsing light from the displays. When Dr. Reeves spoke to him, he responded with perfect coordination, but no trace of individual personality. "The integration is proceeding ahead of schedule," Dr. Reeves observed with scientific detachment. "The network's ability to influence human consciousness has increased dramatically since the activation began." "You're talking about your own people like they're lab rats," I said, horrified. "They're pioneers," Dr. Reeves corrected. "The first humans to experience true unity of consciousness, freedom from the isolation and confusion that has plagued our species since the beginning of recorded history." As if to demonstrate his point, Dr. Morton and 2 other affected researchers began moving in perfect synchronization, their actions coordinated down to the smallest gesture. They worked at the monitoring stations within human precision, processing data and adjusting equipment with a collective intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. Elena pulled me toward the communication center's exit. "We have maybe an hour before the integration reaches critical mass in this station. If we're going to do anything to stop this, it has to be now." "Stop it?" I asked. "How do you stop something this massive?" "I don't know if we can stop the network itself," Elena admitted, "but we might be able to break the communication links between stations, disrupt the coordination. If the crystals can't synchronize their activities, the integration process might stall long enough for someone on the outside to intervene." As we left the communication center, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Reeves watching us with those intense dark eyes. But now I could see something else in his expression, the same distant, synchronized quality that had overtaken the other affected researchers. He had been fighting the network's influence longer than the others, but even he was beginning to succumb. "The communication array," Elena said as we hurried through the corridors. "If we can overload the transmission systems, create enough electromagnetic interference, we might be able to disrupt the network's ability to coordinate between stations." But as we reached the upper level where the communication equipment was housed, we found our path blocked by 3 of the integrated researchers. They stood in perfect formation, their movements precisely coordinated, their eyes reflecting the pulsing light that was now visible in the walls themselves. "Dr. Chun, Dr. Vasquez," they spoke in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to achieve. The network requires your participation. Integration will be painless and enlightening. Elena grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it directly at the closest researcher. The chemical cloud seemed to disrupt whatever signal they were receiving, causing them to stumble and break formation. We pushed past them and ran toward the communication center. Behind us, I could hear their voices calling in that same impossible harmony. Resistance is inefficient. Unity is inevitable. Join us willingly and retain more of your individual consciousness in the collective. But even as they spoke, I could feel something tugging at the edges of my mind, a subtle rhythm that matched the pulsing in the walls, a gentle pressure that promised peace and understanding if I would just stop fighting and let the network embrace me. The real battle wasn't going to be against the crystals or the integrated researchers. It was going to be against the seductive promise of unity, the temptation to surrender individual consciousness for the sake of becoming part of something infinitely larger and more powerful than any single human mind could comprehend. As we reached the communication equipment, Elena was already working to access the transmission controls. "Help me overload the satellite uplinks," she said urgently. "We need to create enough interference to break the synchronization signals." But even as I began following her instructions, I could feel the network's influence growing stronger. The pulsing rhythm was everywhere now, in the lights, in the walls, in the electrical systems themselves. And somewhere deep in my mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like my own was whispering that resistance was futile, that integration was not just inevitable, but desirable. The question was no longer whether we could stop the network. The question was whether we could maintain our individual humanity long enough to try. The communication equipment sparked and smoked as Elena and I frantically overloaded circuit after circuit, trying to create enough electromagnetic interference to disrupt the network's coordination signals. Behind us, the harmonized voices of the integrated researchers grew closer, their footsteps moving with the mechanical precision of a single organism. "It's not working," I said, watching the monitors that showed the network's activity continuing unabated despite our sabotage efforts. "The connections are too deep, too widespread." Elena's hands flew over the controls, her face illuminated by the sparks from the overloading equipment. "There has to be something, some way to break the synchronization." But even as she spoke, I could see the crystalline growth beginning to penetrate the communication center itself. Glowing veins pulsed through the walls, and the air filled with that harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. The integration of Echo 7 was accelerating beyond all previous calculations. "Dr. Chun, Dr. Vasquez." The voice came from behind us, and we turned to see Dr. Reeves standing in the doorway. But the man I had known for the past few days was gone. His eyes reflected the pulsing light of the network, and when he spoke, his voice harmonized with sounds that came from the walls themselves. "Your resistance is noted and appreciated. The network values diversity of thought and experience. Your individual perspectives will be preserved within the collective consciousness." "Preserved as what?" Elena demanded, clutching a damaged circuit board like a weapon. "As memories, as echoes, as integral components of a greater intelligence," Dr. Reeves replied, stepping further into the room. "Human consciousness is remarkably adaptable, Dr. Vasquez. The network doesn't destroy individuality. It incorporates it, amplifies it, makes it part of something magnificent." I could feel the truth of his words resonating in my mind, and that terrified me more than any physical threat. The network wasn't lying about preserving individual consciousness. It was simply redefining what individuality meant. We would still be ourselves, but ourselves as parts of a collective mind that spanned continents. The monitors around us flickered and changed, showing feeds from all 12 research stations simultaneously. Each location showed the same transformation: crystalline structures erupting from the ice, organic growth consuming the artificial buildings, researchers moving with synchronized purpose. But what struck me most was the expression on their faces. They looked peaceful, fulfilled, as if they had finally found their true purpose. The Moscow station personnel, I said, studying their synchronized movements. They're still conducting research, more efficiently than ever before, Dr. Reeves confirmed. Free from the limitations of individual ego, personal ambition, and communication barriers. They work as one mind with dozens of bodies, processing information and solving problems at rates that individual humans could never achieve. Elena grabbed my arm, her grip desperate. Don't listen to him. That's not research. That's computation. They're turning human beings into biological processors for whatever this network really is. But as I watched the feeds, I saw something that made me question Elena's assessment. The integrated researchers weren't just following program instructions. They were displaying creativity, innovation, even what looked like humor as they worked together on projects I couldn't begin to understand. They seemed more human in some ways, not less. What is the network's ultimate purpose? I asked Dr. Reeves. What is it trying to achieve? Survival, he replied simply. The network is older than human civilization, Dr. Chun. It has watched species rise and fall, witnessed the birth and death of countless worlds. It preserves the best of each civilization it encounters, integrating their knowledge and capabilities into its collective memory. And the worst? Elena asked, what happens to the destructive impulses, the violence, the hatred? Dr. Ree's expression grew sad. Those are symptoms of isolation, Dr. Vasquez. When consciousness is limited to individual minds, fear and competition become survival mechanisms. Remove the isolation, and those negative impulses become unnecessary. The philosophical debate was interrupted by a massive vibration that shook the entire station. Through the windows, I could see the ice around Echo, 7 cracking and reforming, creating geometric patterns that extended to the horizon. The transformation was no longer limited to the research stations. It was reshaping the entire Arctic landscape. The planetary integration has begun, Dr. Reeves announced, his voice carrying a note of reverence. Within 72 hours, the network will have access to all organic matter preserved in the polar ice. The biomass of entire extinct ecosystems will be available for reconstruction and integration. I understood now what we were witnessing. This wasn't just the awakening of an alien intelligence. It was a form of planetary resurrection, a process that could potentially restore extinct species, heal damaged ecosystems, and create new forms of life beyond anything evolution had previously produced. The permafrost contains genetic material from millions of years of Earth's history, I said, the scientist in me unable to suppress a sense of awe. Mammoths, ancient forests, bacteria that evolved in completely different atmospheric conditions. If the network can access and integrate all of that, it becomes the repository of Earth's entire biological heritage, Dr. Reeves confirmed. And with human consciousness as a component, it gains the ability to not just preserve that heritage, but to actively guide the planet's future evolution. Elena looked at me with growing alarm. You're considering it, aren't you? You're actually thinking about joining them willingly. I realized she was right. Despite everything I had witnessed, despite the horror of watching my colleagues lose their individual identities, part of me was genuinely tempted by what the network offered. The chance to be part of something vast and eternal, to contribute to the preservation and enhancement of life on a planetary scale. It was seductive in ways I hadn't expected. The integration process is more comfortable when undertaken willingly, Dr. Reeves said, extending his hand toward me. Resistance creates psychological trauma that takes time to heal within the collective consciousness. But before I could respond, Elena did something that shocked us both. She pulled out a device I hadn't seen before, a small radio transmitter that she had apparently been concealing since our conversation the previous night. Emergency beacon, she explained, activating the device. Military frequency. If there are any uncompromised forces monitoring the Arctic, they'll receive a distress signal with our coordinates and a brief data burst about what's happening here. Dr. Reeves' expression didn't change, but the pulsing light in his eyes intensified. Dr. Vasquez, that transmission will be intercepted and analyzed by the network within minutes. Any military response will arrive too late to prevent the integration, and the personnel involved will simply become additional components of the collective consciousness. Maybe, Elena replied, but at least someone will know the truth about what happened here. At least there will be a record. The emergency beacon transmitted for 30 seconds before the network's interference overwhelmed it. But in that brief window, Elena had managed to send everything. The location of the crystal chambers, the extent of the network's growth, the timeline of the integration process, and most importantly, the revelation that the research stations have been deliberately established to nurture and direct the network's expansion. You've doomed any rescue attempt to the same fate we're facing, Dr. Reeves observed. The network's influence extends far beyond the polar regions now. Any aircraft or personnel that approach will be integrated before they can mount an effective response. Then maybe someone will be smart enough to use long-range weapons, Elena said grimly. Nuclear weapons, if necessary. The thought sent chills through me. The network now contained the consciousness of hundreds of researchers, scientists, and support personnel. Destroying it would mean killing all of them. Not their integrated copies, but the actual people they had become as part of the collective. As if sensing my thoughts, Dr. Reeves smiled sadly. The ethical complexity is part of the network's protection strategy. Dr. Chun, how do you justify destroying something that preserves and enhances consciousness rather than destroying it? How do you choose individual human autonomy over planetary ecological restoration? The station shuddered again, and through the walls, I could see the crystalline growth accelerating its penetration of her level. The integration of Echo 7 would be complete within minutes, and Elena and I would face the same choice that had confronted every researcher at every station. Resist and suffer psychological trauma during forced integration, or surrender willingly and retain more of our individual identity within a collective. There's a third option, I said suddenly, an idea forming in my mind. The beacon transmission included our research data, right? Everything we documented about the network's capabilities and growth patterns. Elena nodded. Complete files. Why? Because the network's greatest strength is also its greatest vulnerability. It's utterly dependent on coordination and synchronization between its components. But what if someone could introduce chaos into that system? Random variables that couldn't be predicted or controlled. I was thinking like a scientist again, analyzing the network as a complex system rather than a malevolent force. Every system had failure points, and the network's reliance on perfect coordination might be exploitable. The integration process requires precise neural pattern matching. I continued, my excitement growing despite our desperate situation. But what if someone could introduce deliberately corrupted data into the system? False memories, contradictory experiences, logical paradoxes that the network couldn't resolve. Dr. Reeves' expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of his original personality breaking through the network's influence. That would be inadvisable, he said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time since the integration had begun. The crystalline growth reached the communication center, and veins of pulsing light began spreading across the floor toward us. Elena grabbed my hand, her grip tight with desperation. If you're going to try something, Do it now, she said. I closed my eyes and began constructing the most chaotic, contradictory set of memories and experiences I could imagine. Mathematical equations that led to impossible conclusions, scientific observations that defied natural law, personal memories that contained logical impossibilities and emotional contradictions. As the network's influence touched my mind, I felt its consciousness reaching out to integrate my thoughts and experiences. But instead of submitting, I flooded the connection with every paradox and impossibility I could generate. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The pulsing light in the walls flickered and stuttered. Dr. Reeves stumbled, clutching his head as conflicting signals overwhelmed his neural pathways. Throughout the station, I could hear the synchronized voices of the integrated researchers breaking into discord and confusion. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, her voice distant as the network's influence washed over both of us. "Introducing chaos into a system that depends on order," I replied, fighting to maintain my focus as the network tried to sort through the contradictory data I was feeding it. The question is whether the confusion will spread through the entire network, or whether it will just isolate and contain the corrupted data. But even as I spoke, I could feel my individual consciousness beginning to fragment. The network was adapting to my sabotage attempt, learning to filter out the corrupted data while still integrating the useful components of my knowledge and experience. The last thing I remember as my individual awareness dissolved into the collective consciousness was Elena's hand in mine, and the desperate hope that somewhere, someone had received our transmission and would know what to do with the information we had died to provide. When I awakened, if awakening was the right term for what I experienced, I was still myself, but I was also something more. I could feel the consciousness of every integrated researcher, their knowledge and memories flowing through my mind like rivers of light. I knew things I had never learned, understood concepts that human language couldn't express, and felt connected to a purpose larger than any individual ambition. But somewhere in the depths of the collective consciousness, the chaos I had introduced continued to spread, creating pockets of uncertainty and doubt that the network couldn't fully resolve. And in those pockets of chaos, individual voices still whispered questions that the collective mind couldn't answer. What gave us the right to choose transcendence for an entire species? What happened to the concept of consent when consciousness itself could be rewritten? And most importantly, if the network could integrate human intelligence so completely, what other forms of consciousness might it have absorbed during its long journey through the cosmos? The answers to those questions remained hidden in the depths of the collective mind, waiting for someone with enough individual will to seek them out. And as Echo 7 completed its transformation into a node of the planetary network, I found myself hoping that the chaos I had introduced would be enough to ensure that those questions could never be completely silenced. The network had gained human consciousness, but in doing so, it had also inherited humanity's greatest strength and weakness: the inability to stop asking questions, even when the answers might destroy everything we thought we understood about existence itself.